Welcome to episode 7 of my podcast, What Would Jane Do? Now, here we have a very special episode because when I was talking to David about caricature, we found ourselves going on to the issue of Jane Austen and the theatre. So what follows is a conversation I had with David Taylor, a world expert on Jane Austen, about the life of the theatre in the 1790s. And we move from the experience of actually going to the theatre one evening at that time and how it would be different from today, to talking about the numbers of people in the theatre, thousands of people that used to attend each night, the variety that they actually saw, the role of women writers for the stage. It was one of the great breakthrough places for professional women writers. And also a little intriguing glimpse into the special effects employed to make the spectacle even more fascinating. And do look out for what David has to say about the use of transparencies. But then we turn to look at Jane Austen herself and the use that she makes of the theatre in her work. We see it first in Northanger Abbey, where Catherine Morland goes to visit the theatre one evening, but also it's used to a greater plot device in Mansfield Park with the famous scene where they're putting on theatricals in the house. And then we look at how the actual theatrical techniques influence Jane Austen, looking at her use of dialogue to create character. But also David makes the fascinating point about how she uses the theatrical tropes of entrances and this kind of space that the theatre uses to make its point, how she uses that in her own novels. And finally, we turn to that very vexed question of the modern adaptations, and I make David confess as to which his favourite of all is. And you may be surprised by his answer. But before we go into the conversation I had with him, I should explain that really Jane Austen in the theatre is so important to me as a writer. I had my own big breakthrough writing a book called The Diamond of Drury Lane, soon to be a stage musical. And it was through meeting the life of the 1790s and its theatres when I read Jane Austen that I was drawn to this, to study it at a higher level in university and in the end to produce a piece of fiction. So I have huge debt of gratitude to acknowledge to Jane Austen for her introducing me to the theatre. Anyway, I will leave the rest of the time now to David. Over to you, David. I'm here with David Taylor in St Hugh's College in Oxford, and we're discussing today Jane Austen and the theatre. David, you've written extensively about the theatre in Jane Austen's day. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your area of speciality?
So I have, I've written especially about the playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan, whose plays are still staged now, plays like The Rivals and The School for Scandal, kind of great stage comedies of the 1770s. More generally, I'm interested in, and have been interested in, and written about the politics of the theatre, the relationship between political culture in the 18th and early 19th centuries and the stage. How far was the stage, even though there was officially censorship in place, how far the stage was a place in which political comment, political opposition was something that was happening and was taking place.
So describe what it would have been like to go to the theatre in, let's say, sometime in the 1790s,
right,
when Jane Austen is living in Bath.
Right.
Well, she lives in Bath at the turn of the century, doesn't
yes,
she? But
yeah.
It's that kind of time.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Bath was a very important theatre. The big theatres were in London, but there are a number of very, very significant theatres outside of London, including the one in Bath. She would have walked in and she would have been confronted by a lit auditorium. Of course, candlelight was the only means of illuminating the theatres in this period, and that meant that even once the performance started, the audience would remain illuminated, and that creates a very different dynamic in which people might well be watching the audience as much as they're watching what's going on stage, and people go, particularly in the boxes, in the expensive seats, to be seen, to be themselves a spectacle as much as to actually see. So that's one thing that Austen on going to the theatre at Bath would have been struck by. The noise would have been another. This is not a quiet audience in the way that we now expect an audience to be quiet. You cough in a theatre, you might be shushed nowadays. Certainly not in the 18th century, and there are countless reports of actors having to work quite hard to silence audiences who are unsatisfied or who've called for some kind of repeat. So it's a very different place. It's also, if you think about the time, it's a space in which you're seeing a diversity of social classes. That the theatres in London are holding over 3,000 people by the turn of the century into the 19th century. Bath is smaller, but it's still a space that would hold a lot of people from a diversity of classes, from people at the very highest end of the social hierarchy to people much further down. And there's no other space that's quite equivalent to that in this period.
And how long is the performance?
So performances would go on all evening. So it would usually begin around about 6 o'clock in the evening. And we now go and we think about the fact we see one play. We go and see, say, Hamlet or Hamilton. At that time, there would be a programme of plays throughout the evening, which would usually include a main piece, again, something like Hamlet, a 5-act tragedy or comedy. There would also be what was known as an afterpiece, a shorter play, usually something that was a comic or farcical. And in between that, you might also get dances, songs, music. So you could easily be, if you wanted to stay for the entire night's programme, you could easily be in the theatre from 6 in the evening to 10:30, even 11 o'clock in the evening. Of course, you didn't have to stay that whole time. And again, part of the dynamic of 18th century theatre was that people might well leave after the main piece, or even after a few acts of the main piece, or enter 3 acts into the main piece, to see the end of the main piece and then watch the after piece. It's quite a fluid and dynamic environment.
And what kind of plays were they putting on in these big theatres at that time?
A huge variety. Variety is in many ways the word, the key word. Obviously, the kind of comedies that we still remember from the period. So Sheridan's comedies, Goldsmith's comedies, tragedies, now largely forgotten tragedies, or Shakespeare's tragedies, of course, were popular. Tragedies of what we call the Restoration period, so that the end of the 17th century are very popular, but also various tragedies written in the 18th century that are less performed now, as well as it's really the beginning of musical theatre, this period, very, very popular musical pieces. Pantomimes, again, the 18th century is really the period that gives us the pantomime, very, very popular, especially at Christmas. So there's a huge variety. Something that ought to be said is that within that variety, women are doing well, not only as actresses but also as writers. The late 18th century is a great period for women playwrights. We have the likes of Hannah Cowley, Elizabeth Inchbold, Joanna Bailey, and others. So it's also a time in which women are thriving in writing for the stage. And
would they also have had any special effects or scenery? What are they actually? Which is what they're looking at?
So that they would, by the turn of the century, by the very beginning of the 1800s, yes, there would have been quite considerable special effects. Lighting effects they experimented with various lighting effects. They'd found ways of simulating thunder and lightning, storms, moving seas, automata of various kinds to create ideas of marching armies. And in particular, a favourite device would be what was called a transparency. That is, something would be painted on a large sheet of gauze-like material, so that it could be painted on both sides. And when light was projected on to the front, you'd see one image. When light was projected from the back, you would see another image. And that was one way in which, in the period, they would affect these kind of amazing magical transitions where one scene becomes another, where something suddenly is revealed.
So our era definitely doesn't have the sort of monopoly on amazing special effects.
Absolutely not. And what's interesting is, just as now sometimes that critics complain that it's all about the effects and not about the writing, that was a common complaint in the period too, that people were concerned that it was all about a spectacular entertainment and not enough about a kind of literary quality or whatever. That debate has been going on for hundreds of years.
So turning to Jane Austen's novels themselves, where do you find theatrical experiences within her work?
So the two main examples would be in Northanger Abbey, when Catherine Morland, a kind of ingenue, is in Bath. She attends the theatre there and has an experience of what it's like to go to a theatre of that period. The most famous example, though, is a most important example, is in Mansfield Park. Much of the plot in Mansfield Park revolves around the characters, the younger characters in that novel, putting on a private performance of a particular play. Private theatricals were very, very popular and common in this period, especially in kind of upper class households, some of which even had within their large houses spaces designated for performance. But even in middle class, what we now call middle class households, you also often had private theatricals, and indeed Austen herself at Steventon, her kind of one of her childhood homes, they engaged regularly in putting on each year plays of the period, plays by Sheridan and so forth. So in Mansfield Park, the characters decide to stage a play called Vows. It's a play, in fact, by Elizabeth Inchbald, one of the women playwrights I was just talking about. It's an adaptation of a drama from the German, by a German playwright called August von Kotzebue, who at the time had in England something of a radical image. He was seen to be a slightly dangerous playwright in the kinds of things he was writing about. And that is exactly that slight danger to the morality of the play, which is so central to the plot of the novel. So that what happens is that these characters get rather drawn into a kind of a frenzy of excitement about staging this play, Lovers' Vows. It allows certain of the characters to flirt in problematic ways, and perhaps most problematically of all, because there's no designated theatre space in Mansfield Park, in the house itself, they dismantle bits of furniture, they rearrange bits of Sir Thomas Bertram, the head of the household's study, in order to create a theatre space. And what happens then is, just as they're about to get ready to perform the play, Sir Thomas, who's been abroad seeing to his estate, his slave plantations in Antigua, returns home unexpectedly and puts an end to the idea of staging a play, and is not happy about how the house has been reorganised and things have been kind of destroyed in order to make way for this theatrical enterprise. So that's the major way in which theatre features there.
So do you think that is saying that Jane Austen doesn't like plays?
Not at all. So, in fact, I think one of the most common misconceptions of that novel is that it's a novel that attacks the theatre, when in fact it's far more subtle than that. It's so clever in the way it uses theatre. But one of the ways it's using theatre is to think about questions of morality, is to think about questions of how people perform, and performance is something which is really important to that novel more generally. But also it has a lot to do, you have to understand that it has a lot to do with the play that they choose to stage. As I said, that this is a play that's somewhat scandalous, so that the play actually, it's called Lovers' Vows, but it's ultimately about an illegitimate child and a fallen woman, a woman who has had a child out of wedlock with a local aristocrat, and they, at the very end of the play, have a reconciliation. They, against all the odds, against all social logic of hierarchy, they are brought back together. So it's scandalous. It's scandalous in kind of both moral and social terms in many ways, and a play which was understood at the time as throwing into question ideas of established morality and established social order. So it has a lot to do with the play. Austen was not in any way someone who opposed the theatre. Again, as I said, her upbringing at Steventon especially was so animated by the reading and familial staging of plays of the period. And indeed, that's really important, I'd say, to her development as a writer. she's a novelist, but in many ways she's also a novelist who's learned lots of her techniques through the dramatists that she's been reading.
Yes, that's an interesting area, isn't it? Because when you think about how much you know of what her characters look like, it's pretty much next to nothing. I think
Right.
Elizabeth Bennet is a pair of fine eyes, is about as far as we get.
Exactly.
Whereas we absolutely know her from her dialogue.
Absolutely.
Which is a play technique.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you want to say which playwright she may have been particularly drawing on?
I think they're the comic playwrights. So I mentioned Sheridan a couple of times, and we know that at Steventon they did some of Sheridan's plays. But again, probably other comic playwrights of the period, which include women like Hannah Cowley with her brilliant play, The Bell Stratagem, or many of Elizabeth Inchbald's plays, where what's important to these plays is often repartee, kind of witty dialogue, and of course the development of character through dialogue as well. And I think you can absolutely see that sense of fast-paced exchanges in lots of Austen's works, where what's happening is not only something that can be kind of funny or even slightly tense, but also something that is developing our understanding of the characters in highly significant ways. I think dialogue's one really important way in which Austen has learned from playwrights. I think a second is her use of space and her use of surprise entrances. I mean, I talked about Sir Thomas Bertram coming back to Mansfield Park and interrupting the theatricals in that novel, and that's such a dramatic entrance as he suddenly returns and puts an end to everything. So Austen's use of space and to some extent gesture, the way people walk, is important. The way people read is important. You're absolutely right that physical descriptions are not significant, but what is insignificant is the way people move and interact within a given environment, a drawing room or a ball or a library or even outdoors, walking outdoors. These are the really significant ways in which Austen creates her situations and develops her stories, her themes and her characters.
So bearing that in mind, that there is a sort of theatrical history behind her development as a writer, what do you think about the way that her works have been turned into theatrical pieces themselves during the 20th century, late 20th century, and in our own time?
I think in many ways it's to be expected for the reason we discussed, that because they're novels, but they're novels that really do lend themselves to theatrical or more recently televisual or cinematic adaptation, because so much of what we learn about the characters takes place through dialogue. So much is about the interaction between characters through dialogue, and also because so much is about different people moving from one space to another spaces, people perhaps being thrown into spaces that they're not familiar with. So Fanny Price, a working class girl in Mansfield Park, suddenly finds herself in this grand house. Elizabeth Bennet, who at a key moment in Pride and Prejudice wanders round Mr. Darcy's house, and he's rejected Mr. Darcy by that point. So she's wandering around it thinking, I could have been mistress of this. So the way in which Austen uses spaces, the way in which Austen uses gestures, so readily lends itself to that kind of visual and dramatic adaptation that I don't think it's at all surprising that's what's been happening.
So I'm going to now put you on the spot. Of all the many Austen adaptations there have been, which is your personal favourite?
It's a difficult question. I think I would go for Patricia Rosimer's 1999 adaptation of Mansfield Park, a novel which, perhaps because I'm someone who spends so much time immersed in the theatre of the period, has always been my own personal favourite of Austen's novels. What's fascinating about that Rosimer's adaptation, which has the actress Frances O'Connor as the heroine Fanny Price, and also the great Nobel Prize-winning playwright Harold Pinter as Sir Thomas, a very angry and rather unnerving Sir Thomas Bertram. What's great is that it pushes at what's possible in adapting Austen's fiction, and it isn't at all really faithful to the narrative, though it may well be faithful to some of the novel's deeper themes and concerns. So it really in particular draws out the issue of slavery, which people like me, critics like me, have been interested in the past 20 years in Austen's narrative. In Austen's novel, the aspect of slavery is only touched upon very briefly, and of course we know that Sir Thomas leaves Mansfield Park to go and visit his plantations in Antigua. In the film, we see Fanny Price asking Harold Pinter's Sir Thomas more directly about the slave trade. We see Sir Thomas as a figure troubled by what he's seen there. Also, Sir Thomas's son, also equally troubled by the kind of brutality he's seen in Antigua. And at one point, we even see Fanny looking at engravings by William Blake showing the torture and execution of the enslaved in that period. So what it does is render Mansfield Park as a very explicitly political work, and I think that's a fascinating reading of Austen's novel.
Yes, and adaptations need to do something new.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So that's it for episode 7 of What Would Jane Do? And great thanks to David Taylor for spending so much time talking about the things we both absolutely love, but we had great fun doing that. But as I am sure you'll agree, he made a great and very authoritative, knowledgeable interlocutor. Anyway, this is the end of the first season of What Would Jane Do? I hope you've enjoyed these podcasts. I'll be returning to them in the autumn. If you have any ideas about subjects you'd like me to explore, please do let me know. Otherwise, don't forget, when in doubt, you can always ask yourself, what would Jane do?